This was a world war, and the fighting was not limited to the western or eastern fronts. The Turks, humiliated in a series of short but bloody wars in the years immediately preceding 1914, were seriously underestimated by the Allies. The Ottoman Empire had been dismissed by Tsar Nicholas I of Russia as the sick man of Europe. But after victory over the Allies at Gallipoli, Turkey's visions of empire were renewed. The British government realized the vulnerability of strategic oil supplies from the Persian Gulf. A small military force was dispatched from India and sent up the Shatt al-Arab to Basra. Reinforced once again, the force pushed up the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. 2 infantry divisions and a cavalry brigade made up the improvised Army Corps under Sir John Nixon. The Turks resisted vigorously. A second force, under the command of Major General Sir Charles Townshend, advanced up the less heavily defended Tigris with the goal of capturing Baghdad. The landscape on the road to Baghdad was harsh. Seas of drifting sand cresting into yellow dunes, thorn bushes dotting the plains, deep valleys gashing the earth, and jagged rock towers soaring 400 feet high. The bleak desert was dappled by sudden shimmering spots of green, high grassland and lush oases, packed with date trees over wells of spring water. Everything was baked under the omnipresent blistering sun. Temperatures often reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Townshend drove his men hard through the blazing desert heat. On November 20th, 1915, they reached Ctesiphon, some 25 miles south of Baghdad. Weary and low-spirited, his Indian troops failed in a mishandled attack on November 22nd. Townshend fell back on Kut and dug in, confident that he could sit it out until reinforcements of men and supplies reached him. The Turks, now under the command of the former advisor to the Sultan, General Colmar von der Goltz, invested the garrison. A number of hastily organized attempts to rescue Townshend failed. By January 1916, supplies were running low, and the garrison was forced to eat their horses. A final rescue attempt was made on April 16th, which failed. With his men starving, Townshend surrendered. His men were sent on a 1,200-mile death march, in the course of which over 4,000 soldiers died. In August 1916, the arrival of General Sir Frederick Stanley Maude as Commander-in-Chief transformed the campaign. The Turks, still fighting stubbornly, were racked by disease, and they failed to stem Maude's relentless advance. The British followed close on the heels of the retreating Ottoman troops and captured Baghdad without a fight on March 11, 1917. The Commonwealth troops were greeted with enthusiasm by the residents. Some 9,000 Ottoman troops were caught in the confusion and became prisoners of the British. General Maude issued the Proclamation of Baghdad, which included the line, "Our armies do not come into your cities and lands as conquerors or enemies, but as liberators," a statement still famous among older Iraqis. In spite of what General Maude had to say, the British knew they needed to possess Mesopotamia's oil fields to hold on to their far-flung empire, even after the fighting ended. Gertrude Bell arrived in Iraq on the heels of the victorious British Army after a decade of on-location studies in the Mideast. Born in County Durham on July 4, 1868, to a family of great prosperity, Gertrude Bell was the daughter of the great industrialist Isaac Lothian Bell. This family wealth was later used to finance Gertrude's travels around the world. At the age of 16, Gertrude went to Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, where she became the first woman to achieve a first in history after only 2 years of study. Thereafter, she traveled to countries such as Iran and Mesopotamia. Her fascination with Arabic culture led her to learn the Arabic language. In 1915, Gertrude was summoned to Cairo, where she worked on behalf of the Cairo office, which was helping to foment a rebellion of the Arabs against the Turks. Because of her intricate knowledge and personal dealings with the Arab tribes, Gertrude was able to offer a wealth of information and detailed maps that were used by T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, and others in the successful Arab revolt. In 1916, she arrived in Basra and was able to draw maps helping the British Army reach Baghdad. Bell became the only commissioned female officer in the British Army. For her service, she was later awarded the Commander of the Order of the British Empire. This was a world war, and the fighting was not limited to the Western or Eastern fronts. As stalemate set in Europe, the British high commanders were looking to mount a new offensive on another front. But where? The Baltic? The Mediterranean? In the early days of August 1914, two German warships, the Breslau and the Gruben, were being pursued in the Mediterranean by 16 British ships. To evade capture, the boats raced to the Turkish coast and were given to then-neutral Turkey to be added to the Turkish Navy. Pasha Enver, the Turkish Minister of War and Commander-in-Chief, had been trained in German military schools and was key in helping to modernize the Turkish army along the German model. The Pasha allowed the Breslau and the Gruben to enter the Black Sea and run amok, shelling Russian ports. By October 31st, the Turks were at war with the Allied powers. As Allied commanders looked around the map, the Dardanelles looked to be a sparkling prospect. By taking the peninsula, it will allow grain to leave Russia and munitions to get in. It would also induce the rest of the Balkan countries to join the Allied cause, in addition to being a good defense for the Suez Canal in Egypt to the south. By January 14, 1915, it was decided that a naval expedition would be sent to the Dardanelles. By February 18th, Allied warships were cruising through the Dardanelles, blasting Turkish forts to pieces. Occasionally, Marines and bluejackets were sent ashore to blow up Turkish gun emplacements, rarely encountering resistance. It seemed all too easy. Churchill beamed,
"The greatest satisfaction was expressed at the Admiralty, and I found myself in these days surrounded by smiling faces."
Then unexpected events began. Abandoned Turkish forts sprung to life with new guns and more soldiers. Minefields surfaced in the Channel, and the trawlers appointed to sweep the mines were driven off by gunfire from ashore. Opinion began to shift as to whether the Navy could finish the job alone. Lord Fisher, First Sea Lord, commented,
"The Dardanelles, futile without soldiers. Someone will have to land at Gallipoli some time or other."
But where were the soldiers to come from? In Egypt, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, troops were mustered from throughout the empire. But they were ill-equipped and under-trained. A regular division had to be freed from the Western Front for the operation. Lord Kitchener reluctantly gave up the 29th in order to join the campaign in the Turkish Straits. The French also offered a division. In total, 70,000 men were ready to invade the Gallipoli Peninsula. To lead the offensive, Kitchener appointed his friend Sir Ian Hamilton. Kitchener told him,
"We are sending a military force to support the fleet now at the Dardanelles, and you are to have command. If the fleet gets through, Constantinople will fall of itself, and you will have won not a battle, but the war."
On March 18th, Hamilton watched the fleet deliver its final blow to the shores of the Turkish Straits. They shelled away until suddenly the French ship Boave exploded and then sank in a matter of minutes. Aboard were 700 men. Before the day was over, 3 Allied ships rested at the bottom of the straits, and 3 more were severely damaged by mines or by gunfire. the fleet was ordered to retire. Constantinople was sent into a panic, and the city was preparing to evacuate. But as the days passed and the Allies never appeared, a new confidence overtook the Turkish commanders. Even Pasha Enver was most optimistic.
I shall go down in history as the man who demonstrated the vulnerability of the British fleet.
The new Turkish exuberance turned inward, and the Christian Armenians, tribal peoples with their homeland partly in Russian hands, partly in Turkish hands, were massacred. Over 750,000 died. Their crime, suspected traitors to the Turkish war effort. The Pomeranian, Otto Lindemann von Sanders, was given the command of 6 Turkish divisions to defend the Gallipoli Peninsula. Under his command, the Turkish army built defenses atop the hills along the strait and waited for the Allies. But they didn't come. Problems with the supply chain in Egypt complicated the preparation of troops. Hamilton decided on a 6-pronged attack, with 2 faked offensive to confuse Sanders' Turkish troops. The French would land on the Asiatic coast and withdraw, and further north, at Blair, a mock offensive would be staged by the British Navy. At 4 a.m. on April 25th, the Anzacs were determined to make a name for their young nations.
It was pitch dark. Then all of a sudden, a dim outline of the coast loomed up. As we got closer, we were all getting tensed up now and nervous, wondering what was going to happen as everything was so quiet. Then a single shot rang out, and a yellowish light flared up in the sky. From then, everything was let loose. Machine gun and rifle fire directed at the boats. The pinnaces cast us off. The muddled oarsmen took up the row. We were rowed ashore. As soon as the boats grounded, it was every man for himself. It was out. As we scrambled ashore, those were lucky enough to get there, we found what cover under the cliff we could. As we lay there for a few moments, gathering our wind, we slipped off our pack, fixed our bayonets, and someone in the crowd, there was no officer, no one in charge. The order was, right lads, after the bastards.
Von Sanders was awakened at 5 a.m. by several panicked reports that the Allies had arrived. He hurried off to wait for them at Blair, but they never came. The mock attacks had worked, with the French landing on the Asiatic coast and taking 500 prisoners as they withdrew. Opposite the French at S Beach, or Morto Bay, the landing was a success, much like at Y Beach, where over 2,000 men landed without casualty. But they did not press further inland to Krithia. At the southernmost point, Hell's Point, where Landing Group V Beach was slated to land, the situation was more dangerous. In broad daylight, the SS River Clyde scuttled. Ramps came down, and several boats loaded with troops began their way to the shore. The Turks were waiting.
They had these nice little pom-pom shells, all nice painted colours, beautiful things. And they was hitting off at the side of the ship and ripping the people to pieces. And even the bullets, if they missed you, was hitting the ship and going and tearing pieces out of them.
The Allied troops were forced to take cover behind the River Clyde and wait until nightfall. The beach was taken the next day, but only after bitter fighting. With beachheads established, the Allied forces took stock of their gains. The best footholds were at Hell's Point and Gaba Tepe. Gaba Tepe was renamed Anzac Cove after the Australian and New Zealand Corps that fought there so bravely under the command of Sir William Birdwood. The order came from Hamilton to attack and reach the objectives, which were unfulfilled after the landings. The Anzacs pushed the Turkish troops to the limit and were on the brink of a major breakthrough when a young general named Mustafa Kemal rallied his troops to defend their homeland.
I don't order you to attack. I order you to die.
The Turks rallied and, under their new commander, pushed the Anzacs back across their bridgehead. The Anzacs dug in and waited for the Turkish counteroffensive. They came in waves. From April 28th until June 4th, 3 battles raged around Krithia.
They came over in 2 great waves from their trenches, in great hulking mass, which they were rather big men, the Turks, fine body of men. As they came over in 2 great waves, they were shouting "Allo" and blowing their trumpets and whistling and shouting like schoolboys. As they got closer, within nice rifle range, we had the order to fire. We opened fire with rapid fire and brought them down in hundreds. Hundreds of them fell. And in front of our trench, I should think, when the attack was over, there would be anything to 2,000 to 3,000 dead and dying in front of our brigade. They were lying there, and for about 3 or 4 days, the smell got so awful. We prayed that the wind would blow in from the sea and take the stench of the dead over into the Turkish trenches instead of blowing it to our own, as the stench got so awful at that time.
Bodies piled on top of bodies in the Mediterranean summer. The stench was horrendous. A frontline armistice was called so that the bodies could be buried. Turkish troops and Allied troops crawled out of the trenches and buried their dead in common graves. No distinctions were made. The summer dragged on. The Allied camps oscillated between 2 extremes, that of boredom and death. Men dug out homes in the hillsides where they would cook or play cards. Bathing in the sea was a welcome respite from the heat and a chance to get clean. Water was in short supply, thus there was a constant element in the camp, scurrying about distributing water to the thirsty men. The darker side of the camp was the smell of death, men rotting in the no-man's land.
During the day, we could see the vultures heading down toward the bodies of both Turks and their own men. And occasionally we would take a pot shot at them to try and keep them off, particularly if we thought there was somebody wounded out in front. But we couldn't fire too much at them for fear of giving away our own position, because the Turks seemed to have very good observation posts and were able to see practically everything that we did.
Water was very scarce, and when the summer came, of course it brought the disease and the flies with it. The rations, of course, was nothing only bully beef and apricot jam. And when we did get the summer, the jam was a regular issue, nothing else but apricot. When you opened that, it was almost like water. You couldn't put it on your biscuit or anything like that. It was just a matter of pouring it on. And before you could get that to your mouth, it was absolutely, well, literally covered with flies. It was a case of holding it with dropping the tin and holding one biscuit with one hand and waving the flies off with the other all the time.
Were the soldiers not hit by Turkish bullets, disease would be there to hamper them. In the summer months of the campaign, more than 1,000 men per week were taken off the front lines with dysentery. And for all the sacrifice the Allied soldiers made, the Turks still held the heights of the region, always watching and looking down on the invaders. Back in Britain, Admiral Fisher, a longtime critic of Churchill's Dardanelles campaign, resigned in protest. Fisher believed that the Dardanelles campaign was wasteful for the Grand Fleet of Britain. A few weeks later, the Liberal-led government was ousted, and people called for Churchill's resignation as well. The army was getting bogged down and did not appear that it would be able to break through. On the battlefield, though, there was a certain amount of respect that the Anzacs and Allied soldiers began to harbor for the Turkish soldiers.
The Turkish soldier was very highly regarded by me and all the men on our side. And he was always a clean fighter and one of the most courageous men in the world. When they came, there was no beating about it, but they faced up to the heaviest rifle fire that you could put up, and nothing would stop them. They were almost fanatical. We came to the conclusion that he was a very good bloke indeed. We had a lot of time for him.
On the other side of the trenches, the Turkish soldiers were impressed with the ability of the Allied soldiers, who made bombs from jam tins, their ability to make a home and a harbor from unfavorable terrain. After German U-boats snuck into the harbor and sank 2 British battleships, the fleet was ordered out. As the ships slipped beneath the summer sunset, most of the faith in the cause died, but not before one more attack. On August 6th, the bold landing was made at Suvla Bay, in front of a dried-out salt lake. The landing was a success, but the weakness of the newly mustered troops shone through, as they did not advance further inland. To the right of the landing, the Australians were steeped in their worst fighting at Lone Pine. Intended as a diversionary tactic to cover the new landings and Allied movement across Sari Bair, Lone Pine became notorious for the Anzac troops. The Australians' goal was to seize the Turkish trenches above Anzac Cove. Upon getting up the hill, the men were not able to enter the Turkish trenches because they were covered in earth and logs. From this angle, the Turkish troops shot at the Australians from point-blank range, and casualties were high. The Turkish army sent several waves of new forces to take back the trenches, but ultimately failed. With over 10,000 Turkish and Australian casualties, it was one of the bloodiest battles of the entire campaign. However, the overall goal of the operation did not succeed. The new landing force was held up, and no significant gains were subsequently made. Hamilton began to lose hope in the whole operation. On October 16th, he was called back to London. His replacement was Sir Charles Munro, who visited the landing sites and concluded that no breakthrough was possible. Churchill lamented,
He came, he saw, he capitulated.
Kitchener was in agreement with Munro.
Well, I've seen the place. It's an awful place, and you'll never get through.
The situation was complicated by the entry of Bulgaria into the war on the side of the Central Powers. Having reviewed the state of his command, Munro recommended evacuation. Kitchener disliked the notion of evacuating the peninsula and made a personal visit to consult with the commanders of the 3 corps, 8th Corps at Helles, 9th Corps at Suvla and Anzac. The decision to evacuate was made. Evacuation of 14 divisions in winter in proximity to the enemy would be difficult, and heavy losses were expected. The untenable nature of the Allied position was made apparent when a heavy storm struck on November 27th and lasted for 3 days. There followed a blizzard at Suvla in early December. The rain flooded trenches, drowning soldiers and washing unburied corpses into the lines. The following snow killed more men from exposure. The most successful operation during the entire Gallipoli affair was in fact the evacuation. In order for the retreat to be successful, the Turkish army must never be aware that the Allies were leaving. Elaborate ruses took place on the beach to keep things looking as normal as possible. Men swam, supply boxes were carried from place to place. Rifle mechanisms were made to keep the front lines looking active. In December, the Anzacs escaped. By January, the Hels was evacuated. As the last munitions were blown up by naval guns, for the men who were there, the bizarre nightmare of the Gallipoli campaign was over. It was one of the most anticipated naval battles in history. On May 31st, 1916, the British Grand Fleet collided with the German High Seas Fleet off the coast of Denmark, in an encounter that became known as the Battle of Jutland. The conflict had been brewing for a number of years, ever since Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany had begun building up the German Navy in order to challenge the naval dominance of the British fleet. The competition slipped into high gear in 1905, when the British introduced the first dreadnought, a supersized battleship that carried larger guns and was faster than its predecessors. Soon, both countries were adding these new superweapons to their fleets as fast as possible. At the beginning of World War I, the British fleet was dispatched to the North Sea, where it established a ring of steel off the German coast that effectively prevented the movement of supplies into the country by sea. This left the German fleet bottled up in its ports. The Kriegsmarine was eager for a fight, but restricted by Kaiser Wilhelm's fear of losing his precious naval weapon in a battle. The British Grand Fleet was split into two sections under the command of Admiral Sir John Jellicoe. The dreadnought battle fleet with which he sailed formed the main force and was comprised of 24 battleships and 3 battle cruisers. The battleships were formed into 3 squadrons of 8 ships, further subdivided into divisions of 4, each led by a flag officer. Accompanying them were 8 armored cruisers, 12 light cruisers, 51 destroyers, and a mine layer. British reconnaissance was provided by the battlecruiser fleet under Admiral David Beatty. 6 battle cruisers, 4 fast battleships of the Queen Elizabeth class, 14 light cruisers, and 27 destroyers. Air scouting was provided for by the attachment of the seaplane tender HMS Engadine, one of the first aircraft carriers in history to participate in a naval engagement. The German High Seas Fleet, under the command of Vice Admiral Reinhard Scheer, was also split into a main force and a separate reconnaissance force. Scheer's main battle fleet was composed of 16 battleships and 6 pre-dreadnought battleships arranged in an identical manner to the British. With them were 6 light cruisers and 31 torpedo boats. The German scouting force, commanded by Franz Hipper, consisted of 5 battle cruisers, 5 light cruisers, and 30 torpedo boats. The Germans had no equivalent to Engadine and no heavier-than-air aircraft to operate with the fleet, but had the Imperial German Naval Airship Services force of rigid airships available to patrol the North Sea. The German battle fleet was hampered by the slow speed and relatively poor armament of the 6 pre-dreadnoughts of 2nd Squadron. On the British side, the 8 armored cruisers were deficient in both speed and armor protection. Both of these obsolete squadrons were notably vulnerable to attacks by more modern enemy ships. German armor-piercing shells were far more effective than the British shells, which often failed to penetrate heavy armor. 2 formidable forces were about to clash, bringing into sharp focus the training, experience, abilities, and ambitions of 4 legendary admirals. Hipper and Scheer on the German side, Jellicoe, and Beatty on the British. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon of June 1st, a British naval force of 28 battleships, 9 battle cruisers, 34 light cruisers, and 80 destroyers was bearing down on the Germans. The first engagement began shortly before 4 o'clock, when Hipper and Beatty's ships came within sight of each other. During the action, the British battlecruiser Indefatigable was sunk, and 1,017 men drowned. Then the battlecruiser Queen Mary was blown out of the water, taking 1,266 men with her. At 6 o'clock off the coast of Jutland, a second engagement began in which Hipper and Jellicoe were in contention, with 96 British ships placed between 59 German ships and their base. Hipper's flagship, the battlecruiser Lutzow, was disabled by 24 direct hits. Despite her damage, the Lutzow, with guns blazing, was able to sink the British battlecruiser Invincible, taking all but 6 crewmen with her. The Lutzow shortly thereafter followed her foe to a watery grave. 994 German sailors went down with her. Beatty's flagship, the Lion, was damaged and taking water. Then, at just after 6:30, Scheer carried out a previously practiced withdrawal back to base, losing only a single obsolete battleship, the Omen. For the Germans, despite having fewer losses than the British, the Battle of Jutland was a mauling. After it, they decided not to risk a major naval engagement again. Britain had lost 3 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 8 destroyers. The Germans lost 1 battleship, 4 cruisers, and 5 destroyers. The Kaiser's boastful comment was, "The spell of Trafalgar is broken." But the German fleet never again sought battle with the Grand Fleet, and Scheer's report to the Kaiser stated that victory could only be achieved by submarine war against British trade. The outcome of the Battle of Jutland was also a blow for Britain, which had hoped in any such major naval engagement to use its superiority in numbers to break the power of the German fleet. A somewhat depressing Admiralty communique was followed by a second one, drafted at the British government's request by Winston Churchill, putting the battle in a more confident light. The one indisputable fact was that hundreds of young men, many of them midshipmen only just in their teens, had gone down without hope of rescue or understanding of the issues to a cold, anonymous grave. On the British warships, 6,097 sailors had drowned. On the German ships, 2,551. On June 5th, Britain suffered another devastating loss at sea. In the cold waters of the North Sea, a British cruiser on its way to Russia, the Hampshire, was sunk by a German mine northwest of Scapa Flow. On board was the Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener, the man who rebuilt the British Army in 1914. He was on a special mission to Russia. As the ship went down, Kitchener vanished beneath the waves. Although his cabinet colleagues had long thought of him as ineffective, for the public, he was the man who had constituted the strength and stability of the governing war-making instrument. Because of the repression by the Turks and their Central Powers allies, Grand Sharif Hussein, as the head of the Arab nationalists, entered into an alliance with the United Kingdom and France against the Ottomans on June 8, 1916. Evidence that the Ottoman government was planning to depose him at the end of the war led him to an exchange of letters with British High Commissioner Henry McMahon. McMahon convinced him that his assistance on the side of the Triple Entente would be rewarded by an Arab empire encompassing the entire span between Egypt and Persia, with the exception of imperial possessions and interests in Kuwait, Aden, and the Syrian coast. The British government in Egypt immediately sent a young officer to work with the Arabs. This man was Captain T.E. Lawrence, known now as Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence's major contribution to the revolt was convincing the Arab leaders, Faisal and Abdullah, to coordinate their actions in support of British strategy. He persuaded the Arabs not to drive the Ottomans out of Medina. Instead, the Arabs attacked the Hejaz railway on many occasions. This tied up more Ottoman troops, who were forced to protect the railway and repair the constant damage. In 1917, Lawrence arranged a joint action with the Arab irregulars and forces under Ada Abu Tayyi, until then in the employ of the Ottomans, against the port city of Aqaba. Aqaba was of interest to the British as a supply base for the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, as well as the Arab revolt. On July 6th, after an overland attack, Aqaba fell to Arab forces. Later in the year, the Arab warriors made small raids on Ottoman positions in support of General Allenby's winter attack on the Gaza-Beersheba defensive line. Allenby's victories led directly to the capture of Jerusalem just before Christmas 1917. By the time of Aqaba's capture, many other officers joined Faisal's campaign. A large number of British officers and advisors, led by Lieutenant Colonels Stuart F. Newcomb and Charles E. Wilson, arrived to provide the Arabs rifles, explosives, and machine guns. A small contingent of French soldiers also joined the Arabs, although their relationship with the Arabs was antagonistic. Under the direction of Lawrence, Wilson, and other officers, the Arabs launched a highly successful campaign against the Hejaz Railway, capturing military supplies, destroying trains and tracks, and tying down thousands of Turkish troops. In 1918, the Arab cavalry gained in strength, and they were able to provide Allenby's army with intelligence on Ottoman army positions. They also harassed Ottoman supply columns, attacked small garrisons, and destroyed railroad tracks. Perhaps due to these attacks, Allenby's last offensive was a stunning success. The Ottoman army was routed in less than 10 days of battle. Australian light horse troops marched unopposed into Damascus on September 30th, 1918. Lawrence and his Arab troops rode into Damascus the next day to receive the surrender. At the end of the war, the Egyptian Expeditionary Force had seized Palestine, Transjordan, Lebanon, large parts of the Arabian Peninsula, and southern Syria. The Ottoman Empire, at the urging of their German ally, chose to attack British and Egyptian forces in Egypt and shut the Suez Canal in the First Suez Offensive. The Ottoman army, under the command of the Turkish Minister of Marine, Pasha Jamal, was based in Jerusalem. At this time, the Sinai was an almost empty desert and very hard for an army to cross. No roads, no water. The chief of staff of the Ottoman army was Colonel Kress von Kressenstein, who organized the attack and managed to get supplies for the army as it crossed the desert. The Ottoman Suez Expeditionary Force arrived at the canal on February 2nd, 1915. The attack failed to achieve surprise, as the British and Egyptians were aware of the Ottoman army's approach. In fighting that lasted for 2 days, the Ottomans were beaten, losing some 2,000 men. Allied losses were minimal. Because the Suez Canal was vital to the Allied war effort, this failed attack caused the British to leave far more soldiers protecting the canal than they had planned on, resulting in a smaller force for the Gallipoli campaign. The British forced the colonial Egyptian army and Egyptian navy to be enlarged to help defend Egypt. However, most Egyptians were poorly armed and poorly trained. More than a year passed with the British troops content to guard the Suez Canal, and the Ottomans busy fighting the Russians in the Caucasus and the British at Gallipoli and in Mesopotamia. Then, in July, the Ottoman army tried another offensive against the Suez. Again, the Ottomans advanced with an oversized division. Again, they ran into a well-prepared Allied force, this time at Romani. Again, they retreated after 2 days of fighting, August 3rd through August 5th, 1916. This attack convinced the British to push their defense of the canal further out, into the Sinai, and so, starting in October, the British, under Lieutenant General Sir Charles Dobell, began operations into the Sinai Desert and on to the border of Palestine. Initial efforts were limited to building a railway and a water line across the Sinai. After several months building up supplies and troops, the British were ready for an attack. The first battle was the capture of Magdahaba on December 23, 1916. This was a success. The fort was captured. On January 8, 1917, the Anzac Mounted Division attacked the fort town of Rafah. The attack was successful, and the majority of the Turkish garrison was captured. The British had accomplished their objective of protecting the Suez Canal from Turkish attacks, but the new government of David Lloyd George wanted more. The British Army in Egypt was ordered to go on the offensive against the Ottoman Turks in Palestine. In part, this was to support the Arab Revolt, which had started early in 1916. In part, it was to try and accomplish something positive after the years of fruitless battles on the Western Front. The British commander in Egypt, Sir Archibald Murray, suggested that he needed more troops and ships, but this request was refused. The Ottoman forces were holding a rough line from the fort at Gaza on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea to the town of Beersheba, which was the terminus of the Ottoman railway that extended north to Damascus. The British commander in the field, Dobell, chose to attack Gaza using a short hook move on March 26, 1917. The British attack was essentially a failure. Due to miscommunication, some units retreated when they should have held on to their gains, and so the fortress was not taken. The government in London, believing the reports from the field which indicated a substantial victory had been won, ordered General Murray to move on and capture Jerusalem. The British were in no position to attack Jerusalem, as they first needed to break through the Ottoman defensive positions. These positions were rapidly improving, and credit for the Turkish defense is given to the German Chief of Staff, Baron Kress von Kressenstein. A second attack on the fort of Gaza was launched 1 month later on April 17, 1917. This attack, supported by naval gunfire and even a few early tanks, was also a failure. It was essentially a frontal assault on a fortified position, and it didn't work, at the cost of some 6,000 British casualties. As a result, both General Dobell and General Murray were removed from command. The new man put in charge was General Sir Edmund Allenby, and his orders were clear: take Jerusalem by Christmas. Allenby, after personally reviewing the Ottoman defensive positions, asked for more forces: 3 more infantry divisions, aircraft, and artillery. This request was granted, and by October 1917, the British were ready for their next attack. The Ottoman army had 3 active fronts at this time: Mesopotamia, Arabia, and the Gaza front. They also had substantial forces deployed around Constantinople and in the Caucasus front. Given all these demands, the army in Gaza was only about 35,000 strong, led by the Ottoman general Mustafa, and concentrated in 3 main defensive locations: Gaza, Tel ash-Shari, and Beersheba. Allenby's army was now much larger, some 88,000 troops in good condition and well equipped. Many of the British forces were Anzacs from Australia and New Zealand. A key feature to the British attack was to convince the Turks and their German leaders that once again Gaza was to be attacked. This deception campaign was extremely thorough and convincing. When the British, in fact, launched their attack on Beersheba, the Turks were caught by surprise. The attack on Beersheba has been called the last successful cavalry charge in history. The victory on October 31st, 1917, did not end the campaign because the Turks redeployed some forces and largely held their position. On the 7th, the British attacked Gaza for the third time, and this time the Turks, worried about being cut off, retreated in the face of the British assault. Gaza had finally been captured. The Turkish defensive position was shattered. The Ottoman army was retreating in some disarray. General Allenby ordered his army to pursue the enemy. The British followed closely on the heels of the retreating Ottoman forces. An attempt by the Turks to form a defense of a place called Junction Station, Wadi Sarar, was foiled by a British attack, November 13, 1917. General Falkenhayn next tried to form a new defensive line from Bethlehem to Jerusalem to Jaffa. The first British attack on Jerusalem failed, but with a short rest and the gathering of more infantry divisions, Allenby tried again, and on December 9th, Jerusalem was captured. This was a major political event for the British government of David Lloyd George, one of the few real successes the British could point to after 3 long, bloody years of war. On the Turkish side, this defeat marked the exit of Pasha Jamal back to Istanbul. Jamal had given real command to German officers like von Kressenstein and von Falkenhayn more than a year earlier, but now defeated like Pasha Enver was at the Battle of Surinames, he gave up even nominal command and returned to the capital. General Allenby finally launched his long-delayed attack on September 19, 1918. The campaign has been called the Battle of Megiddo, which is the correct spelling of the name of an ancient town known in the West as Armageddon. Again, the British spent a great deal of effort to deceive the Turks as to their actual intended target of operations. This effort was again successful, and the Turks were taken by surprise when the British attacked Megiddo in a sudden storm. The Turkish troops started a full-scale retreat. The British bombed the fleeing columns of men from the air, and within a week the Turkish army had ceased to exist as a military force. Australian light horse troops marched unopposed into Damascus on September 30th, 1918. T.E. Lawrence and his Arab troops entered Damascus the next day to receive an official surrender. The war in Palestine was over. The Turkish government signed an armistice on October 28, 1918, and outrightly surrendered 2 days later. 600 years of Ottoman rule over the Middle East had come to an end.
Up to your waist in water, up to your eyes in slush, using the kind of language that makes the sergeant blush. Oh, wouldn't join the army, that's what we all inquire. Don't we picture the poor civilians sitting around the fire? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war, it's a lovely war. Be a soldier, eh?
Oh, it's a shame to take the pain.
As soon as the valley is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead, but we never get up till the sergeant brings the breakfast up to bed. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? Oh, boys, right, son, how will we spend the money we earn? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, be a soldier, eh?
Oh, it's a shame to take the pain.
As soon as the valley is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead.